Hi, Jennifer.
Nice to meet you, Marybeth.
It's great that you're able to take some time as we're here at the Arctic Frontier Conference in Tromsø. And this session is called Arctic Frontiers Unpacked. And I hope we could sit down and unpack some of the discussions we've been a part of regarding Arctic Council and Arctic security.
That sounds great. There's certainly lots to cover.
More than we can do in this, so we'll do the high notes on this one. But before we get started, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your current work, maybe some of your past, and how did you become an Arctic nerd? Sorry, expert.
No, absolutely a nerd. I would say I'm an Arctic policy nerd. What I would say, the easiest way to explain it is I was in the Canadian government for 18 years, so I lived as a practitioner in that space, and then decided I had too much of my own opinions about things, and that I was probably better positioned to advance policy, good policy from outside the system. So I went out and did a PhD. And that's when I discovered the Arctic. So ironically, or if it's sort of a confession on my part, I came to the Arctic both because it was a confluence of really important policy issues combined with some opportunities about thinking about governance differently. And what I feel that we need to tackle some of the hardest problems we face today are different ways of thinking about governance. And so I gravitated towards the Arctic Council and the Arctic sort of environment where we see some innovations, and to state the obvious, but especially in terms of the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the Arctic Council, which really brought me there.
That's great. And I was hoping, could we start with the Arctic Council? Because at one of your seminars or your panel discussions that I attended, there was a Arctic Council representative in the audience, and after listening to the conversations, he got up and he said he felt he was like a sick patient in the hospital, and all the doctors were standing around him trying to figure out what were his symptoms and what was the diagnosis and what was the prognosis. And could you explain why he felt like that? And did you doctors figure out
what the problem was
and how to fix it?
That's right. Well, I think part of the challenge is for someone who works on the inside, and for me it's sort of interesting because I did work for the Arctic Council for 4 years. So in some ways I was like, but I'm one of you too. But ultimately I have to recognize that there are conversations and there are hard decisions that have been taken over the last 2 years, 3 years now, that I think where you're never going to have the full story. And so it's sort of this, but there's more and more people speculating and commenting on the actions that are taken. And so you have this...
Are you specifically referring to Russia?
That I'm talking about, so the Arctic Council paused for a period of time after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was then followed by sort of the introduction of some reintroduction of activity, followed by some new guidelines. So we all were sort of assessing and commenting, was it dead? Was it, going to survive? All these kinds of things.
We're doctors.
We're doctors. So my assessment is that we can say a lot more about how the Arctic Council is progressing. Even 8 months ago, I think that even people within the system couldn't have said convincingly that they were certain that there was a path forward, that with these new guidelines, because there's the creation of the guidelines, but then there's the implementation of the guidelines, and there's always that risk when you're actually trying to translate guidelines into action, that it's how it's interpreted by one party or another. There's so many different variables that can really change the way we think about things.
Right. So what's the prognosis?
I think my simple answer would be, well, a week ago my answer would have been different. I think that the Arctic Council with those guidelines has found a constructive path forward. I don't think it's enough. I think it has to lead to more. But I think that we have seen sort of a progression in the right direction. I do think that given what we've seen in terms of the new U.S. administration coming in very recently, that we're going to have to think very carefully about really depoliticizing the Arctic Council even more, which is exactly the direction. So I think it's set up well to shift and really emphasize a depoliticization, a focus on the issues, on the projects, on the assessments, and really on the work at the grassroots level. And that's where it really needs to do it. I think we, as much as possible, need to separate it from high politics right now.
And what do you, I mean, crystal ball perhaps, but what do you think they should be focusing on in the next few years, and what do you think they'll end up focusing on in the next few years? Will it be different?
Well, I think so. In terms of things, I'll give you three examples of things that I think they should focus on. I think one of the critical things that the Arctic Council needs to sort of keep in its grounded around is that it's there to support the issues and interests of the people of the Arctic, right. And that in particular communities and Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. And with that means a conversation. So I think that making sure that the permanent participants are asked what are your priorities and trying to find projects and initiatives that meets their needs. I think institutions that connect to communities like the Arctic Mayors Forum, for example, trying to find things that really prioritize less of the sort of global issues and more of the sort of what are some of the real regional challenges, whether that be health, mental health, energy and communications, infrastructure, those kinds of things. That's a real place where I think that the Arctic Council can serve a purpose. I think the second one is around climate science. I think that in all of the conversations about not being able to cooperate, if we can't cooperate on this, then we've really missed the bigger picture, and we're sort of focused on the trees and missing the forest. And so I really hope that can be, if I had to choose, that would be an area that would continue to be critically important. And the last, which I referenced in the last session, is emergency management and preparedness. I think the greatest risk in the Arctic, especially as we see an increase in activity, is going to be that there's going to be an accident or some unanticipated thing where it's going to be a transboundary in nature. And that means that you need people that can work together, and that has to go beyond political and geopolitical tensions.
I think it's a great transition into talking about Arctic security and moving away from Arctic Council in this conversation. Because you did just finish a discussion about security, and it came after another discussion about security. And I was wondering if maybe we could take a step back and define security before we talk about it, because in the last few days, there's been so much discussion of security as if it is the same as military and defense.
Absolutely.
Should it be so narrowly defined?
No, I feel very strongly that it shouldn't, and it worries me when we aren't clear. I think that security in the Arctic context in particular is so much broader. I know there's always, and I always suffer from, there's a risk of broadening it and everything being a securitization narrative and things that, you could lose yourself there too. But I do think that when we confuse security with military and defense and militarization, that we miss a lot of really important issues.
But what else should it be? I mean, it should also be defense and military, but what else is there that they should be in the conversation?
I mean, ultimately, security, military and defense is a means to an end, and that is that people can feel secure. And so what are the other components of what that means? That means health, feeling healthy, well-being, communities.
Sure, in a pandemic, you're not feeling very secure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so we saw huge, and that was an area that I thought was incredibly important in terms of showing us some of the vulnerabilities in the Arctic, but also some of the strengths. In the COVID pandemic, we saw breakdowns of supply chains, but we also saw communities mobilize in particular ways that is unique to the cultures of the Arctic. So I think looking at the security infrastructure, I think you really do need to think about communication. You need to think about health and safety. And so those kinds of things give you very different answers to what the policy issues are and how you respond to them if you start to think about those, because they're interconnected. Sure. And if you overlay and you overshadow with a military agenda, then you really risk not hitting the right notes. So, I was going to say one more thing, but
more,
yeah. So I think the other important thing, and then this is another area where I struggle, is I think military and defense is a huge budget item for a lot of Arctic countries. And so one of the things that we also sort of recognize is that it can be an opportunity. So as we see an increasing security narrative by Arctic states themselves, more interest in what it means to have military engagement in the Arctic, you also can see how you could meet some of the other needs of Arctic communities.
Like dealing with a natural disaster or
Absolutely.
an accident.
Or an infrastructure, a pier, right? Or communications infrastructure. These are things you need a runway because you need to have planes that land for military purposes, but how can you build that? But then this is, coming to a conversation we just came from, it's the dual use kind of component to it.
And what does that mean?
Dual use is so that you build infrastructure for the military, but also consider how it needs to be built and where it needs to be built in order to meet community needs more broadly.
So you could use it as an evacuation
Absolutely.
platform in case there was a
Absolutely.
disaster, a wildfire, or an
Absolutely.
oil spill. Or,
Yeah.
right.
Communications technology so that it provides redundancy for the sort of communication technology for communities, but it also serves a purpose for military secure communications, another example.
You know, you said in just this recent panel we came from that you were really worried about the escalation of rhetoric when we're talking about the Arctic and we're talking about security. Can you give us some examples of where it's overblown, what you're worried about?
Yeah, I think what I would say is it's rhetoric that is overblown and it's also simplified.
Okay.
The easiest example, because it's one that everybody's using, is China and Russia and their joint military exercises going up through the Bering. And I think that one of the things, I'm not saying it's not real, I'm not saying that it has multiple purposes for Russia and China. What I find concerning is that we also need to acknowledge that these are completely normal, that the NATO is also running exercises,
Right.
that also, and when we don't balance and we don't sort of clarify that ultimately these can just be legitimate exercises that can serve multiple purposes, that send messages, but maybe not the message that we're here to take over the Arctic, that we are creating a narrative that actually can amplify the tensions on both sides. So how do you think, Russians and Chinese, the same way that we will analyze statements in the media from Russia and China, how do you think that those messages that we're conveying get interpreted into their media? And so it ultimately can be a form of escalation in and of itself.
And is it just media?
No. It's governments. I'm quite we've seen policies come out from the U.S. We've
Right.
seen policies come out from Canada. There's a more alarmist kind of position being taken, and it's not to say that we shouldn't take it seriously. It's
Right.
not that I'm suggesting at all. I just think that we have a responsibility to be more nuanced and to be pragmatic and to be sure that what we're saying, we think about all the implications of it. And I think you can still convey concern without that rhetoric of the Chinese have arrived, Russia has nefarious sort of intentions.
And you talk a lot about the people giving the message, but maybe what about the people who are receiving the message? Should they also maybe tone down their interpretation of how they're perceiving the message? Ask the question, is this true what someone's telling me?
Yeah.
Can it be on both sides of the message?
Absolutely. I would say generally that the nature of messages, the nature of communication and how it has evolved in a way that, it's really challenging for the average person to think critically about all the messages they're receiving. And frankly, part of this is sort of a relationship with the general population that they don't even read something unless it's enticing and exciting and
All too
drama
easy to put
built.
a dramatic comment in there.
And that was what was discussed today.
Yeah.
If you don't put in this, the ice is melting, there's a rush for resources, then people aren't going to read it because it's not interesting.
Yeah.
And so that is the culture that we've built in terms of how we learn about issues.
Tone down a little bit,
Yes.
perhaps.
Yes,
Chill.
maybe.
Everyone chill.
Well, and it's interesting because this idea of do we want more people to care about the Arctic? And I mean, I was thinking about because that was a question that was asked, and I was thinking like maybe just a little less. Like what is it that we need in terms of why do we need people to care about the Arctic becomes an important part. Like relative to other regions, what is it that makes us think? And I think there is a bit of an inferiority complex that the Arctic has been in the shadows for a while, and now that it's getting attention, it's like finally they've discovered us, but
Or
there are
maybe they're
consequences.
saying,
Or
changed our minds.
go home. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right,
yeah.
exactly.
Relativity is really important, what you just said, and there has been discussion about, the Arctic has become an unstable region, and you, I think, just recently said today that actually, no, it's quite stable. And if we all tone down our rhetoric and we say, yeah, the Arctic is still a pretty stable region, the last question I would like to ask you is, well, how do we keep it that way?
Yeah, well, what was striking to me, it was actually the Norwegian brigadier who was the one who said that, when asked the question of what do you see in terms of how it's changed, he said, we don't actually see that much change, and it is quite stable. And so I think it's fascinating to me, well, how come we're not hearing that message, right? And so ultimately, when I look at the actual incidences or events that would suggest to me that it's unstable, I don't see it. What I hear are more that it's more of the rhetoric, as we're talking about. And so in terms of how to keep it stable, I think it is, well, again, we're living in uncertain times, and one of the things that strikes me is the Arctic is positioned in a very unstable international environment. And so maybe what we're aiming for is more of the same, because we actually have some tools when it comes back to governance innovation and my passion in governance innovation. Maybe we have a few more tools in our toolbox of ways to work together in different ways to put science diplomacy at the center of the work that we do, to work more collaboratively with communities and Indigenous peoples. Maybe we have some of those flexibilities and governance norms that can actually position us well in an unstable world. And so doubling down on those types of things may be our best solution in the current context.
And talking a little bit more about how people should take heart in that you do have a toolbox full of good tools that you can use.
Yeah.
So you need a keep calm, carry on Arctic.
Yeah,
logo
absolutely,
really
absolutely. But keep calm, carry on. But that means you need to keep doing the work,
right?
Which is fundamentally different than coasting.
So not letting your guard down, but not overblowing anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Jennifer, thank you for joining us and
My pleasure.
unpacking a little bit of today's discussions. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.